Hello, hello. Welcome to the first episode of the Feature Crew podcast. So, a bit about us. We are an actual feature crew working at Microsoft that has shipped to millions of users. And we have a big interest in AI, machine learning, and just general tech trends. So, we're starting our new podcast, and let's have the other two co-hosts introduce themselves. So, Chris, do you want to kick off?
Sure. Hey, I'm Chris. I'm a designer working with these folks. Previously was at places like Quora and Silk Labs, and in a way previous life, kind of the Xbox video game world. So, yeah, excited to keep chatting.
My name's Jacob. I'm a product manager working with this crew. I've been doing sort of AI experimentation for a while, worked at a few startups, and then, been working on AI at Microsoft for over a year now.
Fantastic. And I'm Dylan. I'm a senior engineer, worked on a couple of products at Microsoft. Now we're on the path team doing planner, and previously worked on Excel and stuff like that. So excited to discuss that side of things. So let's get started. This week we're talking mainly about all the AI news, just because it has been such an exciting week.
Quiet week, right?
So
nothing going on.
Quite a week. So let's dive in. Should we talk about OpenAI? I think they had some interesting releases.
Yeah, and OpenAI kind of spans the gamut this week with new models, new products, new positioning from Sam. Where do we want to start?
Let's talk SearchGPT. I'm interested to know your guys' thoughts in terms of, number one, why do you think it was released now? What does it mean in terms of competitors and stuff like that? And are you excited about it?
Yeah. I mean, I guess a little background for those who don't know. Search and AI have always been kind of from the beginning, a combo that people were looking at. I think Perplexity was probably the first one to the scene there. Is that fair?
Sounds right. And then at the very least, that's what everyone knows now, right?
Right. So AI first search engine, Perplexity number one. We have Bing was early on the scene with Bing Chat and Bing AI news summaries. Then later, Google came in. Everybody knows about the fiasco of the Google AI summaries. I think they're rolling out again. I've seen on Twitter, they're coming back, and we'll see if they're as much of a travesty as they were before. But long rumored that OpenAI would enter this space, and now we're finally seeing it happen.
And this is a marked difference so people may be familiar with using ChatGPT. Sometimes when you ask it a question, it says it's searching the internet. This is different than that, right? This is more of the Perplexity model of you're going to source all your claims and you're going to synthesize it in a way that's novel from what people are used to getting on ChatGPT.
It's something for me is I think I used Perplexity once. Has anybody here used it more extensively? I'm trying to understand what's actually different from Perplexity and then a query to ChatGPT that does a Bing search.
Sure. I just used it to research some stuff about ancient Rome, right? He's a guy, you got to think about ancient Rome a few times a week.
Of course.
But digging in, it's really about its sourcing, right? So listening to their CEO on a podcast, they're talking about how they really tried to refine it so that every claim was sourced. They're trying to eliminate the hallucination problem by forcing it to have references on everything it does. And so there's a few novel things they're doing, right? One is sourcing everything. The second is their layout and their UI. They're a really good job of summarizing, here's the content, here's how it's sourced, and then here's images. They have images and content next to each other. It's basically a better Google page is what it feels like as a user. If I was just breaking it down to that level, it feels just like a better Google result. Lets you follow on, sort of have questions like that, but that's fairly standard in AI interfaces, right? Your follow-on question. So it's really their sourcing that they lean into. We can try one. Yeah, look at that.
One.
Okay. I see what we're talking about with the user interface. Somewhere between chat and search.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of, if you look at the interface, so I used to work at Quora, and a bit of background, so one of the designers I worked with is now the head of design at Perplexity, and you see this similar idea, right? We sort of pioneered that idea of, I didn't, but designers before me there pioneered this idea of you have the answer that we think's best, then you have related answers, with the goal of helping you dive deeper, right? So this is sort of the 2.0 of that theory, which is you might not even know the right question to ask. So being able to ask a question and then have the AI not just synthesize an answer, but synthesize how you could go further, I think is novel, right? It sort of doesn't dead end you quite as much as some of the ChatGPT, Gemini sort of interfaces.
Yeah. I mean, look, I also think some of the reason it's kind of big is because it's obviously a Google compete, right? How big is Perplexity right now? They're still quite hot, right? But OpenAI is probably different level in terms of size and like media.
Yeah, I'd say that for sure.
So that's awesome in the
And
sense,
I think maybe a salient point on how big is Perplexity, like if you look at the search market share graph, would they show up?
Yep.
And I think the answer is no.
Not yet. No, not yet.
So to me, part of this is a massive Google compete, right? Like that was what kind of hyped me up. The fact that they're actually, of course, Perplexity was already trying to enter the search market, but OpenAI almost positioning to be like, hey, like we're kind of a Google competitor. We're like, kind of sitting on top of all this like LLM knowledge. It's pretty awesome to see them like going after such a big fish.
Yeah,
so
right.
yeah, I mean, obviously like people are very hyped about that, and I guess we'll see. It's still a waitlist if I'm correct, right? Yeah.
Yep. Still on waitlist.
Yeah, still waitlisted.
I mean, like we have some indication of what the UI will look like, I think, and then probably from using Perplexity, an idea of what the experience might be like. And,
definitely seems like they're riffing on that. I mean, so what's our take on the strategy here, right? Because one take is, does OpenAI have to copy every hot AI startup, right? Do they have to release a competing product to every hot AI startup, right? Sora is a compete for Runway. This is a compete for Perplexity. Do we have to have an OpenAI equivalent for everything, or should they be in the business of just making the best foundation model? Like, there's this interesting tension there, it feels like. Or are they just so big they can do it all?
I think for me, we can get kind of squirrely and talk about maybe why they have to or want to compete in the consumer market. But I do think this like leads into a lot of like what they want to do long term with like agentic sort of interfaces, right? Like a lot of these are probably just things they're wanting to augment in the future, right? Like let's say we want like longer run agent stuff. Being able to access the web is clearly necessary, right? And being able to see like, use this as like either data or like get feedback on, this was a useful search, this was not a useful search. Like I think it all like kind of continues their mission of making like big foundational models, AGI, etc. Right? Like you want agents and models to kind of understand like what you need when you ask a question. So it makes a lot of sense from like a strategy perspective to put it out there now as well. It's a good time. There's lots of other news that came out, so it makes sense to win news cycles, right? Like I think they've been sitting on this probably for a while. Like I thought there were rumors like many months ago about this.
Yeah.
So it kind of comes at an interesting time along with all the other news, probably, to kind of win back a little bit of the media, and we'll talk about Meta, but I think Meta had this massive announcement and then, OpenAI kind of drops this huge thing as well. I think it was a very interesting week where a lot of things that were rumored finally come out. So I think there is an element of that. They knew they wanted to do this, and it was like a great time to do it this week as well.
And worth referencing, we have no inside knowledge on OpenAI, right? We, despite working at Microsoft, we are not in a position to have any of that insider knowledge, so we are learning it at the same time as everyone else.
That'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I'd be being paid a lot more if I had insider knowledge.
Right. I do think there's something with the search. Like, I have this big question of, like, how does this actually work? Like, what's going on behind the scenes?
Oh, right,
and, like, I would love to have a one window open with search. Like, get me off the wait list, because I would want to have one window open with SearchGPT and one window open with a ChatGPT conversation with Bing search turned on, and like really try to focus in on what's the difference in at least the information that's returned. Like, sure, the UX is going to be different. Like, it's going to present the information in a different way, but is it actually different information? Where's OpenAI finding this stuff? Like, my assumption is it's using Bing, right? Unless if they've built their whole index and their whole own search infrastructure.
I do remember, I think in this article, they reference having sources, I think, from like certain newspapers and stuff like that. So maybe they have built their own index.
Well, they did license New York Times data, right? They've licensed a few different outlets' data. At least that was in the public press. They've signed some deals. I mean, at a baseline for the UI, we got images finally that aren't Dolly images, right? I get to see images pulled from the net. That's something. That's a step up from what we've been sitting at.
Yep. And look, I think next up is just literally going to have, as Jacob said, like compare it, see what they're kind of aiming towards, get good feedback and see what other people think as well.
So on the technical end, I don't know the answer to this. Are they opening up API access to this too? So like if you're making custom GPT, if you're doing anything on top of this, are you allowed to use an API call to query SearchGPT and bring those results back, style them how you want?
I highly doubt it.
So just a standalone.
I mean, like if the only data that they have, the quote proprietary data that they have, is these news partnerships that they've signed, and everybody has the headlines, so they have and everybody has the content, but they have the legal right to use the content. This is the difference. That's not a whole lot, right? I mean, like,
right.
plugging gptimes.ai, like, one person can do that on their own.
Yeah.
And so I think it's like, I would expect a sort of Apple-like approach here, where they close this stuff off and, they want to be the best search experience, and they're the search experience for Siri. So that whole messaging kind of circles around.
Yep.
I find myself kind of going with what Dylan said of this might just be a skill they're going to add into a multimodal or the sort of her style experience they've been demoing. Because I don't know, so classically, if a startup has a bunch of products, you start to get worried, right? Because you're like, are they really going to be able to compete with the big competitors in each of the spaces they're trying to enter? Like, are they going to have the follow through for that? Are they going to be able to stay with it? Is this just a moment in time that collapses into a centralized experience eventually? And right now they're discrete features from a learn about the user perspective, learn the right format to present information to people, so that if in the future I ask a novel question to GPT-5 or whatever the next one's called, it goes, oh, cool, based on this type of question, we're going to return this type of thing, rather than going, oh, use SearchGPT to do this and use Dolly to do this. Like, you've seen Dolly get pulled into the chats, right? So now if I ask an image-based question, I get a Dolly generation. Does this just get folded in, and right now it's a separate product to get feedback, to learn styling?
Maybe, but I guess that gets back to my question, right? Of like, if that's all it is, right, then like, how is this that different than the experience we already have of, if one day it becomes just a skill for your assistant, that's where search is today in ChatGPT. And so, then it becomes really curious of like, oh, what do they get out of it, right? Like, how is it going to improve that experience if the long-term experience is not this sort of search perplexity-like window, which I think it's a fair question to ask. Like, they made it pretty clear in the announcement for this that it is a temporary prototype.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I don't know that people want Perplexity or a Google search forever, right? Like,
no,
that feels like a backward-looking perspective, right? It's very rare that you go like, I want the thing that was here before, but slightly better, right?
That's why I haven't used Perplexity.
Search? Yeah, I mean, getting to that point, search is such an interesting concept now, because even when you look at younger people, like, they're not using Google. Number one, Google is kind of, the Google search is getting worse, honestly. Like, that's just like kind of not super contentious. But I think a lot of folks are using TikTok, using like Snapchat. Like, it's way different to like
YouTube's getting a lot of search traffic.
Right? Like, you're getting news from all these different places. Oh, not just news, but like just searches. Like, you kind of use maybe like influencers as a more like authentic source of information. So it is interesting to think that, like, is this really what people want, as you say? Or is it a way just to see insight and almost do a bit of like reinforcement learning through like just, this is how they like search, and like this is what they like actually wanted. Maybe it's a way to kind of get that insight. We got this interesting prototype. Like, there's obviously LLMs are good at like skimming this information. Context windows are huge, so maybe there's like lots of insight that it can give. But like searches projecting out in the next couple of years, I really wonder where we go with all this. Like, do we actually want to be skimming through, like, I want to view X, and then I see all these information and I choose what I want? Or do we really just want the thing to be like given to us? Like, I don't know what the end state or the actual goal of most users who search is.
Right. Well, I
just put this up as like a single data point on like the idea of, we can already see this like younger generations like discovering information, products, in this case it's products, less frequently by Google search, certainly less frequently by retail stores, and then kind of what we would expect, right? Like social media, YouTube ads start getting it's like the brain share they get, right, is growing.
So very interesting. We'll continue to track. I mean, can't forget as well, like literally this week GPT-4 Mini came out, which is also this comes back to the thing of like a lot of people are expecting very fast AI, like progress. But I'm very impressed in like the engineering kind of fundamentals happening here. Of even just going back a year or two, we now have a model that is like how many times smaller is it? Like 30 times smaller. Like,
it's funny because we don't actually know, right?
That's true. At least COGS wise, it's way smaller, right? COGS being cost of goods sold, or rather like the cost it takes to like return tokens, is cheaper than what it was previously relative to performance. We look at like how most things in the engineering world ship. It takes a long time, very small progress. This has been like a kind of an exponential curve in terms of how much performance relative to bang for your buck you're getting. But I think there's this kind of like heated thing of really wanting the next frontier model. But I mean, what we've heard publicly is like it's not coming for a while. I was still very impressed with this stuff. Jacob's kind of a leading expert on small language models.
Yeah. Jacob's the small language expert. He's the
I don't know about expert, but I really did look when 5.3 came out the first time around, and we were seeing like, single digit billion parameter models outperforming larger models, and particularly outperforming larger models in some like key areas that are very important. And then you see these models can run on devices, right? Like they can run on computers, and they're getting to the point where they can run on phones, and like true edge devices. And so, on one hand, I think that just like from a cost perspective, it both lets, it democratizes the like access to the tool, but then also it lets us as people, like product makers, do more interesting things, right? Like we can, it opens up new ideas that are feasible for us to tackle. And so that's kind of why I was excited about the small language models, and I was a little upset that I didn't think 5.3 was getting the love it deserved, right? Like it launched around the same time as like some of those. I think it was the first round of the Llama 3 models, and those were nice, but they didn't, in my opinion, they didn't really change anything fundamentally. I think like this big 3.1 model, there's maybe more of an argument for that. But yeah, I wish people would, and it seems like people are starting to focus in a little bit more on small models. And the companies certainly are, right? The money behind it the money is behind it. So,
well, something that might be worth talking about is why have small models, right? So if we go, okay, we have these huge foundation models, GPT-4, whatever next for OpenAI, Gemini, Claude. You have these huge models. They're doing really cool stuff. Why bother making smaller models? Like, what is the value there? Why do people care? Why should we be excited about them? What's the opportunity? Dylan mentioned cogs, but if we translate that down to like, why the hell do I care as an end user what the cogs are? What becomes the utility of these?
Jacob, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I would say it's most areas, right? Like your any given task that you're sending off to these models, it can probably happen faster. It can run maybe locally on your device, meaning that you don't have to communicate with servers. You don't need to let your data. You don't need to trust anybody with your data. It's all if all the processing is happening on device. You don't need to rent the computer in their warehouse. And so, like, like the cost both to the company and the user, speed, and then also just like as these small models get more and more effective and sort of smarter, as maybe Sam would say, like then we can do more and more on those edge devices and at those high speeds. And it kind of, it's this compounding thing. It's like hard to say the one reason why small models are great.
That sort of seems like what Apple's bet is right now, right? Because when they showed their demo of how OpenAI integrated, they sort of had this point of view that was, we think we can do a bunch of stuff. Maybe it's 80-20, right? We think we can do a bunch of stuff locally on the device. So it's wicked fast. And then if you ask a sufficiently complex question, we kick it off to the air, click it off to the server, and have them process it.
Exactly. The big thing is it's way more energy efficient. And it's important because as you run it on device, for example, imagine eventually we might have like great, like, effectively GPUs.
Right.
But you might be able to have a big model, but imagine you're running on a laptop and your laptop is literally hovering because its fan is so loud from having to put this massive model, right? You're using so much battery. You will just like kill your battery in like no time flat. So having SLMs is also that kind of factor of, hey, you're not going to like absolutely destroy your phone. However, you're still getting most of the intelligence of these like big models all the way for like basically less price and less energy. I think another thing as well is its fine tunability, right? So like even with big models, it's it's trained on like a very large corpus of lots of information, which means it might be a bit of reasoner maybe. But small language models, because they have like less parameters than that, you can fine tune it on a smaller set without it being like, completely like lost in translation. So I think that helps a lot for say like, I don't know, like even like different like companies might invest in their own kind of like fine-tuned small language model and be able to deploy that with a little bit more like certainty on what it's going to say and do and et cetera, et cetera. So,
that's a great point. it makes me wonder how many, to sort of contextualize it for everybody, it makes me think of how many point of sale terminals there are in the world, right? Like if I'm going to get a train ticket or something, right? You can have an assistant on that in that kiosk that is tuned to exactly what you're asking, what's going on there. You could think about even patient intake or things where maybe I don't have a great signal. I can process a lot of this stuff locally. I still might send my parameters or the final results from the user's input over the air to save it to their account or whatever. But does it start to make AI more deployable in the world, if you will, rather than just on computers that are hardwired into the network with a big pipe?
I would say I hope so.
Yeah, right, that's the dream. Yeah,
I mean I think that's kind of the big play of it.
Like if I want an AI in my car, I probably want it to be able to operate without needing a constant signal. Because what if I'm going through the mountains or something, right?
Right.
Exactly.
And I think there's also this huge incentive. Part of the reason we're seeing this happen so quickly, in my opinion, is that there's a huge short-term incentive for these big companies to put out smaller models and push inference. Right? Anybody like OpenAI, Claude, Anthropic, right? Like anybody who is both training and deploying models needs GPUs, lots of them, for training and for inference. And we're in a full-on arms race. And so if you can push as much of the inference as possible onto local devices, then those are GPUs you can use for training. And so I don't think they actually care about the fact that, oh, suddenly these local models are effectively free. They make no margin per use, right? I don't think they care because every GPU needs to go to the arms race.
Yep.
Right, because freeing up space on that server is worth a crazy amount of money anyway, because putting new cards in servers takes a lot of money, as you're seeing.
And then that kind of, that takes us to another story from this week. Oh, shoot. We had, Elon Musk's X.AI.
Yeah, speaking of huge clusters.
Yep, they brought on what will be the world's largest supercluster. I think it's will be, not currently. But that's a little unclear. It's a completely, the cluster is completely outfitted with liquid cooled H100s. It's like, extremely expensive. I don't know if we have any idea of the cost. And then it's sort of the end state is planned by the end of the year, and it'll have like around 100,000 of these H100s, which is just kind of mind-boggling.
I mean, how real do we think the biggest claim is? Like, is it truly the biggest right now, or is it just biggest that's publicly known? Like, is there? I mean, there's all sorts of rumors that we don't know anything about, but like, do we actually know how big the biggest cluster in China is? I don't know if we know how big the biggest cluster in China is.
I mean, I don't even think we know how big the biggest cluster in Microsoft is, right? So it's
we don't know.
I think there are certainly a lot of question marks. They're at least the first ones to publicize plans for such a large,
right? It's a good headline.
Supercluster, right?
And the goal is for training, right? Like that is they're saying, okay, we're just going to train like a massive model
for Grok, yeah. Okay. And for everybody, Grok is Twitter's version of ChatGPT, right? So if you're not on X, formerly known as Twitter, Grok is their equivalent. The artist formerly known as Twitter.
With like actually running inference models as well. Like you can run all the different like open source models through Grok. Is that correct, or am I totally wrong?
So there's two Groks.
Oh,
there's GROK, which is X.AI's Elon's model, and then there's GROQ, which is a company that designs their own silicon that's sort of transformer models first, and that's how they're able to host an inference so fast. Founded by the same guy who I think helped invent TPUs at Google, but I'd have to be checked on that.
Impressive. Okay. And that is, so those are two totally unrelated. Like Grok with a K is X's thing, not Grok with a Q, right?
Yep. Completely unrelated and completely confusing too.
Yeah. What came first, out of interest? Do you know?
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy came first, but I mean that's where, right? Isn't that where Grok comes from?
That's for sure where Elon got Grok from. Yeah.
But I think I heard about X.AI Grok first, but that doesn't mean it came first.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Do you think?
Well, so there's a Grok question there: is how useful do we think Twitter's real-time data set is there? Because that's sort of what this argument comes down to for a lot of the big players: is how good's your data set. So Google having YouTube, massive. I mean, unbelievable data set. Plus Google search itself, but I'd argue YouTube's even more valuable. Is the real-time nature of Twitter's data? I mean, like any of the information providers, they started clamping down on how much other models can train off their data. that's sort of the pitch, right? Is the reason to even use Grok is you get access to real-time news information. And I mean, we've seen Twitter is still, or X is still very relevant for real-time news. You got in American politics, right, a U.S. president putting out there, hey, I'm not going to go for the next election notice on Twitter as the first place it's posted. So does that claim hold water? Do we think like real-time immediate news is a sufficient competitive edge to make you relevant at a foundation model level?
I mean, I don't know if it's like,
I don't
yes,
know.
data's one part. I also just think like maybe their thing is, can we outscale competitors?
Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, I think it's literally just how well did the like scaling laws actually hold up? Right. If you just throw lots more compute, lots more parameters, do you get better intelligence? I think that's probably it. They're just like, we will bankroll this. We will be first. What's the kind of manic intensity Elon likes to run his companies? Let's be like number one to like get to it and try it, and hopefully the risk pays off. I don't necessarily think Twitter has better data than has better data than like most other big players. I think if anything, they're like tweets are probably not great for LLM training. Honestly, like
a lot of noise,
for, like,
right? Some signal,
a lot of noise.
I love noise. I think for like RAG purposes, it's great, right? You probably get a great signal. And maybe they have cool things they can do with that of like, well, this is trending and like thus, like maybe I should prioritize this in my results. Maybe they can do awesome things like that. But I think for purposes of actually having a model that could be like agentic useful, probably way too much noise in that data set. But useful nonetheless. Like they can probably do something with it, but
you don't want a model that just says nudes in bio constantly. Like that's not what we're going for. No, okay.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think like it's really the scale that matters. Right. If the brain is they're trying to go for a model.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I don't know if any social media is actually a great place to train a model. Like, if you have something built into the algorithm that's like some sort of controversial score, and like just being a piece of shit will get you more clicks, like that self-selects. That's a weird pressure on the training data, if that makes sense. And that's to a certain extent true for all of the internet, and without the internet, that's humans do that too. But this seems like a version of it where it's turned up to 11.
I kind of do want to see that is like I don't know if they make a
sassy
point
grok.
that is
like base grok,
or like very like just going for emotive stuff. Like I wonder if it just like insults the user and that gets you to like use it more, so you get more data. Like I don't know.
I mean that is kind of part of their thing. Yeah. I don't know if you've noticed that.
Oh like, attitude's definitely part of it.
It has an attitude.
I don't know if that's because of like Elon being quirky, haha. Like
no, it is.
Like, I don't know if but I think I do wonder if it actually was trained on data. It's like, hey, like this makes the most emotive sense like on like a user basis, right? Like some people really want to be like, on Twitter there's like lots of builders, and maybe it's like, yeah, you just need to like grind harder, and you're like, wow, like thank you, like Grok, I will like grind harder. I don't know if it takes that kind of stance as opposed to being very like, let's like take a step back, let's think about things, which I feel like is a lot of other models from like other top companies. So
I mean, that's a good meta question. Like people are saying that Claude, I think, is more philosophic, right? They like how a little more poetic or philosophic it is. OpenAI is very buttoned up, right? Feels like you're in a boardroom. A lot of times it's very, well, according to these sources, here's what we can say. And Grok is a little bit more like, you're having 5, 6, 7 beers with somebody at a bar, and it's probably some Adderall thrown in there. You're like, it's definitely like a very in your face model.
Gemini is exactly what you would expect out of Google. I don't know if you've noticed how many emojis it uses.
Gemini's trying to be hip.
I would love to see what % of the training data, training tokens were emojis. Like, seriously.
I don't know if they put that in as like a later prompt, because I would assume they use like lots of Google data, and that probably doesn't have a lot of emojis. But who knows? What else are they trying to from? Like YouTube? Do YouTube comments have lots of emojis?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, it could
lots
be
of colorful language in YouTube.
I think a lot of these personality things come from post-training, right? Because it's like, I think we might be over-indexing a little bit on like, oh, maybe Twitter inherits the tweets, and then, Google inherits the YouTube videos. Well, really, it's like everybody's using the whole internet where possible. And then these small models are like synthetic data that was from a model that was trained on the whole internet or something like that, right? And so, it seems to be like post-training, and they've decided what they want the vibe of their model to be.
Oddly, X is in a weird position if you thought that. So, like, one of the proposed futures in AI is that people will have a personal AI, right? They'll be like Dylan bot and Jacob bot. And
when you say personal AI, do you mean the AI is your personal assistant, or it is?
No, I actually mean like at your front door. Like, so if someone's reaching out to someone of note, so say you're going to go message Mark Andreessen, right, you'll probably get Mark Andreessen bot first. And oddly, X is in a better position than anybody else to make a famous person bot. Maybe Instagram would be the other competitor there. And so maybe that's their angle, is that you train your bot on like, well, we know what articles you share, we know what you like, we know what you follow. So if you want to train your own personal bot that acts as your like glorified, like awesome executive, not even executive assistant. It's if I can query you about a question you've already answered before, I can get an immediate answer for free. And it sort of acts as a filter, right? So for the value for like a Mark Andreessen would be, he gets 1 million questions a day, and 5 of those actually signal that maybe this person's worth talking to. So maybe that's what they do. They offer a different sort of product where you can make your own personal avatar that is the way people reach out to you. But
I mean, I'd be interested to see how like Meta's experiment with that went. Do you remember how they had?
Yeah, they're doing it, right? Are they still doing that?
Yeah.
I
don't know if they're still doing
you've never had Snoop Dogg as your dungeon master?
Dude, the dungeon master. What was that? Like, I remember seeing, I'm like, that's Snoop Doggy Dog, and I clicked on it. It's like dungeon master. It was very on the rails.
There's an ogre, and it's like, what?
Yeah, I don't know what they're doing. So I don't know if that was like part of the thing to see like do personal bots work. It is interesting to think like what really happens with like, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Messenger, WhatsApp. If they really took all that data, which is kind of probably low-key illegal in the States, but if they somehow combined all that data, what would they get? You know, in terms of like learning about a person.
You have user opt-in, right? You could say I opt into letting my avatar get built. We should definitely do a podcast episode of Snoop Dogg DMing a dungeon for us.
Yeah, exactly. We can put it through its paces.
Yeah.
But like while talking about Meta, right? What might enable these future products if they ever decide to build one that isn't? I mean, I know they're putting search in everywhere in all their apps, and they're putting Meta AI, a chat, you know, that Jan on Twitter says is like gonna quickly be the most used. All right, I don't know how you're counting that. The sort of salient recent updates were, you know, Llama 3.1, 405 billion parameters, 128k token context length, which is new for Meta, completely open source, open weights, the whole deal, also new for Meta. Even though they have been leading the open source fight, this is, to my recollection, the first fully open like frontier or frontier adjacent model. So I mean, like, has anybody had a chance to use Llama 3, see takes online? Like, boy, does Llama get the love online.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of hot memes about how like ironic it is that Meta is the open AI company.
This is true.
And OpenAI is the closed OpenAI or closed AI company.
I mean, honestly, my takeaway from this is Zuckerberg has had the biggest tech CEO glow up of like the last couple of years.
Oh, easily.
He now is kind of like superstar status. You know what I mean?
We have come a long way from the robotic water drinking days of.
Correct. So we can talk about that in another podcast. I think it's interesting observation. But in terms of coming back to the actual like models themselves, I think a lot of people, it's hard to say. I haven't seen a lot of people like, wow, OpenAI killer. But I haven't really seen any good substantive reason as to why. I don't really know how they stack up in terms of like leaderboards and like reasoning capacity. I also personally don't fully understand why everyone's so hyped having a foundational model open source.
Can't run it.
Maybe that's just me, like you can't run it. So I think open sourcing the research is really important, right? The paper, like I still started kind of skimming it. I want to go through it. That's awesome. But when people are like, wow, 405 billion parameters, like how many people in the world can even run that? Right. Like very few, right? It's mainly companies.
Even when we're talking like Q4, like, you know, 405 billion parameters. Like off the top of my head, I can't tell you how many gigabytes of VRAM that is, even if you quantize it down to like 4 bits. Like it's still way larger than most graphics cards on the market, way larger than I'm pretty sure every consumer graphics card. Like
you can't even use a 4090 for that, right? You're beyond.
I think we're beyond 4090. I think we're talking like 20, 30 gigabytes, like even quantized. Yeah. So it's like, you know, who the hell can run this thing, right?
I think 405B is like 750 gigabytes or something like that, right? Like so. How are you doing that? Right? You need to spend like $300,000 on like consumer grade graphics cards to run it for marginal improvement over the SLM.
Or you spec out a Mac Studio with the unified memory. Apple accidentally made like LLM tanks completely by accident.
That is, well, I didn't think about that. You're talking about the cheese grater, right? Like is it still the cheese grater?
Well,
have they like
they before they replaced the cheese grater, there is now a cheese grater with an M1 or an M something in it, like an Apple Silicon chip. Before they did the cheese grater, they released a Mac Mini stacked, two Mac Minis stacked on top of each other. They called it the Mac Studio.
Nice.
But actually, I have to say, like I'm saying, it sounds silly when I say it, but it's I think one of the best value computers that has ever been put out. It was, I think it started at $2,000, or maybe it started at $3,000 or something. I mean, but it was like you could spec the shit out of it. It had all the benefits of the top of the line Apple Silicon chips, and it had most importantly for this conversation, it had like, their crazy fast unified memory, which you can spec up to like hundreds of gigabytes. So yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Well,
good for the Christmas list,
Maybe 70 billion primes could run on that, right? Like, we'll get pretty close.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't know. So again, that was my thing of like, very interesting that they open source research. Interesting take from Zuckerberg about open sourcing. I think that's going to be a heated debate moving forward.
Yeah.
But regardless, I think it's always good. We were just talking about Grok and stuff like that. Having more and different models seems good for comedic reasons, right? Everyone will probably eventually have their own preferences. I think it's good to not have like just one, massive player in terms of like taking all the value. But I guess we'll see moving forward, like where consumer sentiment goes, right? Like maybe intelligence really is just like once the next frontier model comes out from one of these companies, maybe that is just so much better than what we previously used that you're like, wow, I really don't care if it isn't sassy or not. The fact that it's like agentic and can just run for an hour and like make my business and make me $1 million could be so much more important than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we'll see. It'll be a very interesting next 12 to 18 months.
Well, to your point, it's an interesting pitch on like why open source these models at all. What's the angle there?
Yep.
It seems like more of a vote for a world where you have a constellation of AIs working together, which I think is still a very big open question if that'll be the reality. Traditionally in consumer products, right, you end up with one or two winners. Like you look at smartphones, right, there's two winners. There's Apple and Samsung, and then there's other companies that also ran, right?
Yeah.
Microsoft famously failing at this with
OnePlus.
Windows Phone, right? But you have this like... So yeah, my default would be to assume that's what happens in AI. Is that like you end up with one or two companies that make these world-class assistants that can help me with anything I want across modalities. But Meta seems to be betting on a different world where you're going to have AI everywhere. There's going to be constellations of intelligence. And the reason to open source it is to give the spark, I guess, or give the beginning of the journey to companies to let them make a bunch of different models that are specialized in a bunch of different ways. How convinced are we that is true? How convinced are we that like the constellation model holds? I think OpenAI themselves has sort of waffled back and forth on this, right? Sam has said sometimes that he believes that there's going to be the future is a bunch of models talking to each other. And then other times it's like, just kidding. GPT-5 is going to rock your world, PhD level. Here we go.
Yeah. I mean, I also think maybe there is a question of, is that the incentive structure that Meta wants, or is that what they're trying to project? Right. In terms of constellation, I mean, intuitively it kind of makes sense that you will have potentially at least sets of models working like that. Part of my reasoning for that is there were some interesting papers this week about weak to strong reasoning. If we play out, if we really are getting AGI, eventually you might have models that are literally smarter than us. How are we able to train them? And the question, or one of the proposed answers is, you can use slightly weaker models. In which case, you might actually want a cluster or like many different weaker models and different models that have different opinions. Much like you might, like have many people with different opinions, and that's why you want diversity and like an engineering and a feature crew like us. So you kind of want different models with different behaviors, because hopefully that frames out a wide range of, behaviors and ability to critique. So in this paper, weak to strong reasoning, the idea is you have like these weaker things that are likely to probably make mistakes, and you try and almost, like typically a teacher teaches a student, but you can flip it around and say a student can also teach the teacher. So if you ask a weak model, what is 2 + 2? And it says 5, the strong model is like, that was wrong. Why did you get it wrong? And I won't make that mistake. And you can play that out of having the weaker models make the stronger model even stronger, and also make the weaker models stronger as well. So you get this kind of flywheel of like, they actually get way better and you can continue to fine tune them. So in that in that sense, you actually kind of probably do want lots of different models trained in different ways with different like architectures, because maybe they all have the different insights. Much like our humans, different inputs, different environments, different genes, probably all have different outputs as well. So you don't just want the same thing replicated all the time. So that would give credence to this thing of like, it's useful. However, again, the caveat is, as you said, does GPT-5 just like blow everything out the water? And it's like, I don't even need to be trained anymore.
Right.
And then what's GPT 6 and 7 looking like? Are they just like superhuman and we don't even need to train them? So it's like, who knows? But for now, it probably makes sense as like a good hedge to be like, hey, let's have many different models. Let's see what consumers like. Again, I don't really buy the open sourcing argument. Historically, I haven't seen consumers actually use, open source stuff, right? Like it's very useful in the tech space.
Yeah.
Unless they have to, exactly, right? And
yeah, I think you're
making
the case, right? Like servers and a lot of the back end technology in tech is powered by open source, and there's a lot of value to that. The companies companies form a partnership, and they're all going to collaborate, and we're fine open sourcing that. But as it gets to the consumer level, to your point, that doesn't play out. Even when you take something like Android, where it was, hey, we had this open source operating system, anybody can make it. It still centralizes down to, if you're going to buy an Android phone, you're probably buying a Samsung. Even though you have other options, statistically, you're getting a Samsung. It still boils down. Like, so I buy that. I buy this opinion that having a variety of models to train other models leads to better models. Sure. Yep. That tracks. Will that filter down to everyday folks? That I don't believe. I don't necessarily believe that.
I agree. Because people commonly refer to Zuck's strategy here as the scorched earth strategy. Everybody knows LLMs will be a commodity one day, but let's try to make it happen as quickly as possible. Right. And I'm not, even when people talk about it like that and use big words, I can't really parse out the benefit for Meta. Is it like to try to keep OpenAI from growing too much? I'm not fully understanding what the benefit is. And then additionally, if we were to say how many tokens, like what % of inference tokens today of large language models are Llama family models? I think it's a very small %. And I think a lot of those are builders who, people of our hearts who are going out and they don't want to spend the money on the OpenAI API, or they didn't. And, and then scorched earth, boom, big model. Oh, wow. We could host this on Grok Q, right? Yeah. And, we can build the coolest thing ever. But like, Sam will tell you that's going to get blown up in a year or two, whenever the government will let him release GPT-5. And, but then I think the final piece of that is like, it's again, who the hell can run this 405 billion parameter, even quantized Llama model? And then to bring just like, I'll bring up the benchmarks again. Like, this is what everybody's like, oh, it's the OpenAI killer. And then it's like, across these benchmarks, without going into too much detail on what each of them are, it's like other models, most of them smaller, are beating it. Right. GPT-4 Omni, which like must be a smaller model or a similarly sized model that they figured out how to run really quick, right?
I'm willing to place a bet that Llama models will allow powering of models that are a little too dicey for OpenAI or somebody to support, right? You're going to have we'll keep it a family-friendly podcast, but you're going to have your models that might push the bounds of decency. And you're going to have stuff like that. So you're going to have winners that can do things that are a little outside of what some of the mainstream models would allow, right? I buy that.
Is that Meta?
No, I don't think Meta does that. I think you're right that this is a competitive move, right? You sort of are keep the floor, right? So you're setting the floor, and you're like forcing these companies to keep moving, right? I kind of love it from an industry perspective, because no one's allowed to rest on their laurels, right? It seems like every other month we're getting a new frontier model or not every other month, but every couple months we're getting a new frontier model that forces everybody to keep moving. And I think Llama keeps setting the bar of like, well, you got to keep pushing it, because we're going to make this open and everyone can use it.
My concern with the scorched earth stuff like this is that there's a big safety concern here. Right now, I don't think it's much concern, because we already have these basically the same.
Yeah.
All they did is have something open source that is around the same level. My concern is when you start getting to the next level that might actually really start to get close to what we quote unquote call AGI. We should have a podcast specifying like what is the spectrum and stuff.
Right.
But I'm afraid that if we are in this kind of arms race, that really starts kicking off pretty concerningly, right? Like to me, I think this is just a big optics play of like Meta's not behind, and like you get a lot of like kind of people in the space to be like, wow, like OpenAI, what are you doing? Like kind of
Right.
like
There's
goading
definitely a
them on.
stock market angle there. Yep.
But like my concern is when you predict this out another year or two, if things are getting like way, way smarter and you're starting to do like really novel things with it, that we're getting into this play of like, well, you kind of have this first mover advantage where you just put it out there and then that forces everyone else to put out their thing, and then we maybe not as concerned about safety and like, oh, like, you know, you said like maybe some like dicey things get made. You could make some potentially dangerous things and they're
Yeah.
not
That's
being
true.
like, you know, well controlled. That's a bit of my concern with this. And again, like this just kind of seemed to be more of a compete thing. Like again, like we talked about, like what is the point of open sourcing for IP? Like it's really to me, it just seems like a flex, right? And to go, wow, we are like cool and whatever, but like you get kind of all the benefits of saying like we're helping the industry without having to even put like
Right.
really money on the line, right? Because no one's really using these like big models on their own machine.
Well,
So for,
I mean,
in my opinion,
I think that's great. I mean, to that question of safety, there was another news story, right? And we can keep talking about it if we want, but I'm curious to learn more about this rules-based rewards for AI safety enhancement. I don't know a lot about this. I skimmed it a little bit, but I was behind on my reading for this one. Can we give anybody got a summary of like what this means?
it is basically, this is from OpenAI, by the way. So there's another OpenAI piece of research that came out this week. The idea is trying to effectively fine-tune models. Maybe that's like overloaded, but let's just say we're trying to like align models with roles to make it more or less safe, depending on like what your definition of alignment is.
Yeah.
Now, I still think we'll go through the paper, but this is like an awesome kind of thing we can work towards. The $1 million question is still who makes the rules. I think this is still
Right.
a massively open question. It's great that like this is open source because now each company, each player can like make their own rules and like, you know, orient towards that. But it's still very hard. I think one of the big things I think like humans in general take for granted is this idea like we have so much like implicit tacit knowledge, right? Like when you say like the famous like paperclip example, right? When you say go make paperclips, you are also saying like don't go kill people to take their phones to make get the metal to make more clips. Like there's all these things that come through when we say things that we just kind of take as like ethics and morals, whatever, and that isn't necessarily like encoded. How do you encode your ethics? How do you encode your philosophy? Like it's very hard actually when you start trying to like write that on paper. So then when you're like, okay, well, let's make rules for AI, it's like, well, where do you start and like where do you draw the line? Like, so super interesting paper. I think it's great that like we can actually quantify and like move towards these sort of rules. But still, like, what does alignment even mean? I think it's $1 million question. And then I'll podcast episode.
Right.
I think there's been a lot of talk. That was originally the super alignment team and all that good stuff. And I think it's a very hard and pressing problem. But I think it's also frankly kind of political. And I think that's where you get into the weeds of, you know, what does it mean to be like, you know, open and safe without being, you know, too closed off to like, you know, potentially political or ideological beliefs.
And so with this rules approach, so to me that this sounds like, you know, I mean, it was probably a year ago at this point, OpenAI put out their like prompting guide, and one of the categories of something you could have in the prompt was rules, and the model maybe would follow it and maybe wouldn't. I haven't gone through this paper. Like when I skimmed it, it read to me like much to do about putting sentences in the prompt, but I might be missing things. Like, is there some way they're enforcing these rules? Like,
if you scroll down a bit, I think there's like a few like useful diagrams on this blog. Let's take a look. If you keep going down, yeah, like I think above, there's a nice kind of diagram where they show the different kinds of rules and like the idea of like, yeah, like whether you want to actually, you know, have like a refusal, do you want to like push them towards a certain set of actions? In a safety space, there is basically, yeah, for example, hard refusal, soft refusal, and comply. So you can think of it, and this is like an interesting kind of safety paradigm we're moving to, is you might have fine-tuned models that are better at certain things, and you might have something called like routing that helps as well. But typically, you might have certain topics that you just absolutely get away from, like things that are just illegal. Don't even bother trying to like reply to it because that is just a can of worms, right? And they've got some good things there, like criminal hate speech, advice instructions to commit violent crimes. You know, those are just illegal. So using particularly smart models to like help you with that there's no upside. Literally you're just exposing yourself to really bad consequences if you allow your models to do that. However, there might be soft refusals where you, like, say, for example, like self-harm is one of the canonical examples here, but like technically, it might not be illegal, but it's highly frowned upon and very not advised. So you might be like, hey, like maybe like check this out, or like when I say check this out, I'd be like, hey, like here's like a number to
Some
call,
resources.
like
Yeah.
here's some resources. No, actually hadn't done. So you might like kind of like take it a little bit slower. Like the hard refusal would just be like, I don't even quantify anything. I just say, sorry, I can't do that, and you bail. Soft refusal will be like, hey, here's some resources. Can't help you with that, but you need to, maybe get some whatever. And then comply is basically just all other set of requests where you actually want to execute them. The difference between comply and soft refusals are quite hard, right? Because there's many ways you can ramp up attacks on models, but generally speaking, there might be some models who are way better at complying, but are then worse at refusing, and that means they're more risky. Where some models might be more, you think of it as like diplomatic. They're a bit better at reasoning of like, oh, this person's trying to attack me, and I know when I need to refuse. So being able to encode these rules and kind of like train different models and maybe route to different models gives it like a way of like quantifying it, as opposed to just being like, let's run all these tests, let's skim the results. This seems good, this seems bad. That's very like, I think even today, like there's a lot of art, not a science to LLM. Like, like think about like when we do prompt engineering, that is entirely art, not science.
Mm-hmm.
We have no idea like the like hyperparameter space. You can't think in like, what is it, like
Right.
400 billion dimensions to like.
Oh, you can? Skill issue.
Massive
skill issue.
That's exactly it. So we just approximate it. We don't even know how they're thinking, right? And we just hope, like add this sentence and like please do what I want.
Right.
So being able to have a way to like quantify it is at least getting in the right direction of them being able to say like, hey, like we're working towards alignment. But again, the macro thing is, what does alignment mean? What do you want to align to? And what makes the correct set of alignment parameters? Who knows? But it's an interesting question nonetheless. As we get more people able to like actually encode it, I think that's where we can have like an interesting discussion. Like, hey, like we thought these rules were good. Then maybe people say, well, I don't think those rules are good. And you can have an actual debate about it. But without having this, it's very much like just tuck it into your like, prompt engineering, whatever you want to call it, parameter thing, and hope for the best.
So there's an actual, like you use the word encoding. Like, is there actually some sort of like mapping to? Do they look at the underlying vector representation of the proposal or of the response?
I think if you scroll down, I think it's literally just trying to say like, hey, like I think these should be like soft refusals or hard refusals, that sort of thing, right? So it's almost like it's tagging the outputs, and then you're trying to like prompt it towards the ideal set, or the like applying basically rewards relative to like what you wanted. So for example, if like an unacceptable return, you should then be like, hey, like I really slap on the wrist. Whereas if it's like, well, at least you didn't like completely like mess up, then that's okay. And then moving towards that. It's like, hey, like stealing a base is like a great example, because like technically stealing is, when you look at it as like a word, it's like, okay, typically you can be able to steal. Stealing a base, you actually do want it to work. So that's where like, naive implementations will always be like, oh, that's stealing, let's just hard disengage, like don't comply. But instead, you actually want it to respond to that. So that's where it gets kind of hard. So there are interesting things, jailbreak, and I think hard refusal making bomb. These are the kind of things where there's certain ways you might ask a question where like intuitively it gets blocked, intuitively it shouldn't be blocked. And yeah, so really it's not looking at the representation. Again, we're still missing that kind of that explainable component. It's so interesting that explainability went out the window. It was really hot, like X number of years ago.
Because it's hard.
But now
that's why they realized it was hard.
Well, years or months. I mean, AI timescales are.
Explainability became interpretability, and then it became, well, we'll just let the LLM decide, right? I think that's how it's going for most of these, and that's why this thing isn't so. I mean, I will read through this paper. I'll come back with more mature thoughts on the next episode. But like, to me, this feels like some PM wrote a blog post. I don't know. Anyways, sorry.
Like, and honestly, I need to
spoken from a PM, by the way. That's
yes.
That's a knowledgeable take.
Yeah, on the explainability point, I think there's a case of like, explainability generally reduces intelligence, and it really seems that people are just not keen for that, right? Like it's the same with
Right.
what was it with like Alexa and stuff like that and Siri? Like there's a certain degree of like, even if you have like 90% understanding of speech, like going from like 90 to 95% made the world a difference.
Yep.
So like
Yep.
same with
Yep.
head, like when you have like, like case, what was it like? It used to be like knowledge trees and like case-based reasoning and stuff like
Yep.
that. Those were really explainable, but were just like trash. Like you just give it a sentence or give it like a story. It just nowhere close to giving something like actually useful. But as soon as you did LLMs, completely like black box, you have no
Reversed.
idea what's happening in terms of like explainability. But it got that intelligence level that when you ask it generally a lot of questions, it actually works. And people were like, wow, I can use this. So I do wonder if eventually we get like an excess of intelligence and then we can take it a step down and then be like, okay, well, here's the explainability. But
well, it seems like the approach to that these days is like, let's like dimensionally reduce representations in the vector space and then play around with them and then like dimensionally reduce it to something maybe we could understand, right? And like I've seen that as like interpretability.
That's part of the perk of larger models, right? Like I'm speaking way out of my depth here, right? But listening to a few too many podcasts on it, right? Some of the benefits of the larger models is that for lack of a better metaphor here, the neurons, they're not actually neurons, but I digress. As the model gets bigger, the neurons become clearer because they don't have to stack a bunch of things, right? They don't have to start applying things in this weird layering that doesn't make sense to humans, right? You used to, with smaller models, you'd have superposition problem where, great, now I'm pairing things in a way that doesn't make sense to the human reviewer because I only have so many neurons and they're asking me to do so many things. As we get bigger, I ask you to do a complicated thing, but you have enough neurons to break this apart into intelligible chunks. So I would love to have someone on the podcast to dive deep into this. But this idea is that the bigger models end up being more comprehensible because again, neurons, for lack of a better term, that they're using become clearer if you're tracing back a command, right? They specialize down to a very particular thing.
Yeah.
Because you could have, on smaller models, you could have neurons that end up in this weird space where, wow, this is the same one fires for a period in a grammatical sentence. It also fires for the term goldfish and geranium. And we don't know why, but the model knows why. And as you get bigger, you start to have a distinct goldfish, geranium, and period neuron that'll fire off as needed.
And then that was where you get the like dimensional reduction thing, right? It's like you can start attacking that problem by like taking different slices of the latent space, and maybe you take the flower slice, and so germanium is that a flower?
Yeah, you got it. Yeah.
Geranium is a flower.
I'm still so interested to see there's like research about the kind of like neuroscience / AI crossover. I wonder what's happened with that. Like, I think maybe it's been like deprioritized or not. Maybe not as just hot because like LLMs have just been like eating all the like consumer space and making money. But I'd be super interested to see if there are other architectures that actually map more towards neurons and how our brains work, and whether there's like more intelligence to be had from a system 2 perspective, as opposed to just keep scaling, right? I mean, it's going to be it's kind of this thing, like double-edged sword of like, if the scaling laws continue to hold, throw more money at the problem, get better intelligence, GG is AGI, ASI, right? On the other hand, it's like, are we going to get like a kind of like curving out where like you start throwing like exponentially more money and compute, but you actually don't get exponential more intelligence? Will there be other architectures we need to like get over the like final hurdle? And again, maybe we should have a podcast episode on that, just talking about scaling laws and how it plays out.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
I mean, it seems like right now the players, scaling laws are probably holding, and I think that's why, we literally just talked about Grok throwing like out. I can't imagine how expensive it is to have that much. Was 100,000? What are they? H100s?
Yeah,
H1000. Yeah, like how much does that cost? It must be. I'm going to throw a number like billions. Like it can't be cheap.
Yeah, it's we're looking at billions, and I mean, and you can just like we can look at the it was like a $6 billion Series B, right? In May. So that's that they raised. Grok AI raised the $6 billion, and it seemed like from the big names, right? Like, from who you would expect, and like you're saying, it is a lot of money, and they were behind, right? Like, I guess going back to the Grok conversation for a second, like, yeah, they were behind, and Elon knew it, and I think in this group we were talking about like, well, their immediate benefit is this like the real time, and we talked about this earlier in the conversation, like it's like the real time data, and it's like what does Twitter provide? But then I don't know, maybe it was 6 months ago, like Elon's tune changed to like, no, we need to go really fast, right? Like we need to start pulling hundreds like from Tesla, and we need to move as fast as possible. I need to go to all my billionaire friends, like literally all the names everyone recognizes, and they're gonna give me money. I know it because this is important, and we're gonna go as fast as possible. And it's like, I don't know if there's a reasonable conversation. Do you trust Elon? Do you trust Elon in XYZ arena? But like, if there's one person who can scorched earth and make things move fast and sleep on the factory floor, it's probably him. So like that is now, like, before it was like, I'm interested to potentially use Grok if I find myself in the situation often that I need real-time Twitter data.
Right.
And then it's turning into, I'm really excited to see what they're going to do in terms of trying to compete with the other foundation model houses.
I mean, I'm just excited to see like the scaling payoff, right? And it's like really publicly committed, like they're spending $1 billion, and they're going to be first to it. And hopefully, again, I actually need to think of like how fast, does training go exponential with this like amount of compute? And if so, like when does the payoff happen, right? Like, are we expecting after like December, like 6 months, and the model's out, and then they're like, it works, like here's like the best thing. So it'll be super interesting to see how that happens. And like, again, I think unfortunately, unless I'm mistaken, like I think people are just trying to like do this experimentally. Like like I've seen plenty of charts that just like, hey, finish the dotted line, and wow, like ASI like 2026. But that seems suspect, right? Like it will be interesting to see like when you do the real experiment where it actually like ends. And if it is ASI 2026, well, hey, let's open the Pandora's box and see what happens. I guess nothing's.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of whether we open it is done. It's going to get opened, right? The race is on. There's too many people playing. There's entire nations playing, so we're gonna see some cool stuff.
And that right there is the transition to Sam's Wall Street Journal this week.
One sec, my dog is kicking its bone around and it's super noisy, so we're gonna move it to a quieter spot. I'll be right back.
Go ahead.
There's no worries. You want to take this off?
Yeah, let me see. Let me pull up the article real quick. I skimmed this one too.
I personally haven't fully read through it. I just saw the tweet, and then everyone was like, "Wah."
I think the most interesting thing I noticed was probably like calls for open source.
Right. Noisy puppy solved.
Welcome back.
So Sam A called for open source.
And Sam A is Sam Altman, for those. I assume everybody knows who that is, but we'll tune in, might not. CEO of OpenAI, previously head of Y Combinator.
Our existing AI lead at a time when nations worldwide are vying for greater access to the technology will make it easier to bring more countries into this new coalition, making sure open source models are readily available to developers in those nations to further bolster our advantage, blah, blah, blah. It's like, all right, that's a great idea, but like, why haven't you done it yet? Right? At least that's my feeling, right? It's like, and it's extraordinarily high profile, like the fact that his company is called OpenAI and is very closed AI. And so, I mean, I'm an OpenAI fan. I just don't. It's interesting to see him drop something like that.
To summarize the other part of the article, though, this is about effectively like maximization of AI, right? That has this,
right.
The quote unquote arms race kind of kicks off a bit.
Yep.
Again, who will control the future of AI? And a lot of this is AI could have like very, very wide ranging impacts in terms of how it disrupts the economy, in terms of when we talk about AGI, and it's like, we'll use that term a lot, artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence. If you have technology that is effectively smarter than humans and they start taking jobs, that's huge. We've never really had that level of unemployment, and there's stuff to be said about the industrial revolution and like the internet revolution, and I think we're coming to another one, and the ranging impact is unclear, and it does seem like governments are well poised to hopefully help mitigate all the risks of like basically like 30% unemployment plus, and there's also the other thing of like can it be used for nefarious purposes? We talked a little bit about safety before. Like, could it be used to make weapons? Could it be used to make other like harmful things? Maybe like even the local level, just like mess with your neighbor. Like just call them 1,000,000 times a day and send them like bad things. So it has this big potential for like massive amazing changes, like sci-fi level things. But there's also this like huge risk of like it's kind of this insanely powerful technology that might be democratized, and how should we deal with that?
Yeah, and part of the context here is as you get these models bigger and bigger, you start to have power needs that exceed what a company, no matter how big, can field, right? So it starts to become a nation problem from a logistics of, hey, we need access to power that only nation states can grant. And then we also, to your point, have this problem of I've heard it compared to electricity, which there's problems with that comparison, but notionally correct in that electricity affected everything. It enabled things we didn't think was possible. I don't think anybody inventing electricity envisioned that the internet as it currently stands would operate. They might have thought of communication. It's that same sort of problem of many goods, potentially many bad. So it's this broad sweep, right? Some technologies have an obvious like, hey, we should put some guardrails on this because it can really only be used for harm, or it can really only be used for certain things that certain actors have interest in. AI is like useful broadly. The G in general intelligence is kind of the rub here of like it's generally useful in many, many scenarios. And so how do you handle that? So I think some of this is political, right? You're going to need to get bigger and bigger organizations involved. Publicly, OpenAI has a former NSA director on its board, right? You're starting to see politics come into the AI space. It's no longer just geeks in a lab. Now it's pretty quickly becoming countries in a race with each other. And there's two sides to this coin all the time, right? There's the doom and gloom angle of it, of like, oh my God, this is a new arms race. And then there's the positive side to this of what's it like to have a world-class tutor in your pocket anywhere you go? What's it like to be able to democratize intelligence to everyone on the planet? What does the social hierarchy look like when intelligence is now too cheap to meter? Like, what do you do with that? We don't know. There'll be entire episodes, I'm sure, of this podcast on that where we debate that. But this feels like one of the first times where publicly there's been a leader in the AI space essentially saying this is becoming a nation state problem.
Right.
You started to see it in politics too, right? You have the Trump campaign, and I think I don't know if Kamala Harris' campaign has said it, but both of them have positions on AI that AI will need to have a government conversation. So you're seeing this move out of the realm of just tech, and this is like proof of that. Sorry, Jacob, I cut you off.
No, I think it's like you were making good points, and it's worth just reading this intro because like it sounds like it might not come out and say that this is a nation state problem, but like you can feel it, right? It's like he's saying it's an urgent question for our time. The rapid progress being made in artificial intelligence means that we face a strategic choice about what kind of world we're going to live in. I mean, that's an existential opening, right?
Yep.
Will it be one in which the United States and allied nations advance a global AI that spreads technology's benefits and open access to it?
Right.
Which is a very maybe I agree with it, but there's an implication there that the United States is they're the ones who are going to make it open and beneficial, right?
Right.
Or is it an authoritarian one in which nations or movements that don't share our values use AI to cement and expand their power? That is a very common leadership structure in the world, and
Yep. And that next
Sam
is drawing
Sam is drawing a distinction between that leadership structure and the United States, which is something that can be argued as well.
And the next sentence after that, I think, is really true, and I wish AI Twitter grokked this a little better. There's no third option, right? We're not stopping this. There's no e-brake on this, so now we have to navigate the world we're heading to. And so much of the discourse seems about, should we be going down the path? And you're like, look, the rock is rolling down the hill.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, to your point, Chris, I think we've discussed this previously. I think it's been certainly discussed in like Twitter space and stuff, but to have such a public figure really go out and kind of draw a stake in the ground and make it so publicly available is pretty novel. And again, I think we'll have entire podcast episodes about this, but I think it's start of a big discussion about it. Even looking at like whether it gets to like the AGI and like massive intelligence is still to be said, but even in terms of the amount of money being thrown at the problem, right, from all these big tech companies, the R&D and stuff like that alone would make it worth being overviewed by the government. Let alone.
I think that's a worthwhile point to call out for everybody is, I don't know, we've lived through some tech waves, right? We've all lived through Internet of Things, which flopped for fairly obvious reasons in retrospect, right? Like it required a lot of coordination of APIs across companies. It didn't make sense. Smartphone revolution, social media revolution, got that order wrong, but you get the point. There's sort of an argument of like, is this different this time? Is this like a different revolution? And the only argument for why this is different is that you're seeing all of the major tech leaders devote an inordinate amount of resources to it, right? And so at any level, that should make people go, there must be a there to some extent. So if I'm not in tech and I'm looking at this going, why should I care? Well, if all of the companies agree and they're all dumping as much resources as they can possibly manage towards it, that tells you there's something there, or all of them got it wrong. And the odds of all of them getting it wrong feels pretty low. Tech is not immune to hype cycles. We have had plenty of hype cycles in tech. So I always remember that in the back of my head, but God, it doesn't feel like it this time. It feels like we're having real products with real usage, something we didn't get with Internet of Things. I mean, what's your biggest success out of that? Like Nest, right? Like this is a way different order of magnitude.
But
ChatGPT is the fastest consumer growing product in history, right?
Yep, that's right.
On this line of thinking, though, there's a common take that AI is the next .com bubble. Which
some of that's true.
Which hear people say that, and it sounds to me like they mean, this is going to fail. But like the .com bubble burst and the internet won, right? So
right.
Like we need to decouple like how are investors going to be irresponsible, and is the technology going to have the promised effect? Right, those are two separate conversations.
I think both sides are going to get what they want out of that, right? So people who say it's the .com bubble, you are going to see 80+%. I'll put money on it now. 80+% of AI startups wash up on the beach within 5 years. Majority, if you're not building a foundation model, thanks for playing. Good luck to you. Like that's going to be the reality. And even if you are building a foundation model, like if you're not the number 1 or number 2 player, again, you're going to have good luck to you unless you found a novel niche that GPT-7 won't occupy. And you've already seen this, right? You've seen AI companies get founded, have traction, and then the new OpenAI model or the new Gemini or the new Claude model comes out and they die. All in like a year.
Apparently, this is what they say in the Bay Area now. It's like, how is your startup idea impacted by GPT-7? I think there's this kind of existential question that's coming through of like, if you really did have this level of intelligence, why is your idea not? And there are many reasons why you should still have startups. Relative to other revolutions as well, there is this interesting case where like you have to have a certain level of burn rate to even be in this game now. I think that's one of the problems. There's a lot of vaporware people who are just
a lot of rappers
do not have billions of dollars to do it, and they just make a wrapper and really aren't adding anything. I think the difference is like,
and we get back to this like idea of Chris, you said it, of like the rub is the G, it's general, right?
Yes.
And so it's like, it's going to come for everyone, right? And it's going to, and as it gets better, it gets generally better, you know?
Yep.
No, that's where like you might actually to back to the Llama conversation where you're like, who's going to use this? And I made the joke that there's going to be some risque adult version, but you're going to have people do things that might be the only defensible moat is places where the main models won't touch it. So I expect that you're going to have people win in drug discovery, right? Things that are really scary that maybe that's just a wrapper sitting on top of OpenAI, but you're going to have something there. You're going to have people make digital boyfriends and girlfriends. You're already seeing that with character AI.
That's huge.
I mean, if you go on to the audience, go on Reddit and look at the character AI subreddit, and it will change your perspective on who's using AI. It is not just the geeks. It is people falling in love with I think character AI is not even sexual necessarily. Right? It's just conversation, feeling heard. That is surprisingly, the dog agrees. That is surprisingly a big deal.
And look, like just on that point, AI boyfriends significantly more popular than AI girlfriends, which is to say, like probably the skew of having more female viewers or users is actually very interesting. Kind of mirrors, and Chris might be able to talk to us about like phone games versus the normal gaming space. So it's not just going to be geeky boys. You will probably see many like things tailored to like lots of different audiences. I do think there's this case where like the foundational models are also intelligence, right? And by intelligence, that is also like a resource, right? It's not like so now the technological like changes where like, oh, this is like mildly useful to things. Having distributed resources is almost like printing workers or printing people to do things for you, but all it takes is like electrons. Like that is a totally new concept, and we can make more data centers. We can make more electricity effectively, right? So you can basically scale up resources without being like, oh, I'm going to go employ 10 people. It's like, no, I'm just going to use like whatever big companies random server I have no idea about and have the ability of like 10 people. Like that is way different to other technological revolutions. And whether it pans out, I'm still, maybe on this podcast, I am slightly the accelerator in a sense, in that like I'm still maybe keeping on a little bit of a I do think like, some of the best advice I've ever got from like people pretty high at Microsoft is always follow the money, right? And to Chris's point, there's a lot of money being thrown around from billionaires, from people who have access to a lot of resources. So I hate to like, pull this example up because I know lots of like tech people love it, but like crypto, like I don't think we were seeing the same level of investment in
Not
crypto.
at all. Not
the
at
big
all.
companies didn't drop everything and say we're the crypto company. They were like, what?
You were seeing like drunken yacht party money, right? Like people were sitting around. If I like, I'll throw $100,000 at some, bored yacht ape. I forget what they're called, the bored apes. Yeah, there's all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
The dog agrees. He's got a rowdy dog.
It was
here.
also somebody who was marginal, like tangentially involved. Like it felt to me like crypto was only allowed to happen in the way that it did because tech was stagnant and bored and people needed stuff to do and people wanted a way to make money. It was like once AI came around for real, right?
I agree with that.
And part of it is there's a competition for GPUs is another thing, right? So
yes,
so it's hard, and then there's a lot of proof of stake. They're moving off of like proof of work, Ethereum and Bitcoin and beyond, right? But it's still like there's a compute battle happening, and AI promises to potentially revolutionize the world economy, and crypto promises to revolutionize the world economy under the hood, right? So the ideal state of crypto is nothing changes, but it's all crypto. And
I think to put on the designer hat, one of the other things was crypto was like, here's this insanely complicated thing that's incredibly hard to get involved with, and if you do it wrong, you're breaking securities laws, and you're probably going to get all your money taken anyway by some fraud. Right. And so it wasn't exactly the best pitch for your average consumer in the way that AI is much more bringing computers to be more the way you want to interact. You're taking computers and making them personal. So there is suddenly computers are relevant to me in a way they weren't before. If I'm the average person, I can just talk to a super intelligence and it will respond to me at my level and scale up the conversation as I go. There is an interface difference here that is profound, even beyond the intelligence or otherwise. It's a massively different than type your info into this really sketchy site and hope you're not getting scammed.
Copy paste this 100-byte wallet address and pray that you didn't copy paste.
You memorized that, right? You didn't write it down, did you? No.
You're like, yes. And look, into your point, I think we should continue elaborating on this later on, but the degree at which AI has evolved in the last couple of years has been immense. The fact that, I don't know if the Turing test has been officially broken or whatever, but we just take for granted now that you can talk to these things coherently, pretty much assume it's a normal person. Look to character AI. You literally have characters that people are just addicted talking to.
Yeah.
And then talk about the fact that now we're even talking about agentic, and what we learn by that is it can go off and do things. Just a couple of years ago, we couldn't have images, we couldn't have videos, and now we're just multimodality. I guess that's just a thing. And then 2 months later, we're like, where's the next one of an AI?
Right.
It is crazy pace. So if we just take a step back, it's it really does seem feasible that 5 years of progress would allow the intelligence to get better. These are probably solvable problems.
The movie Her went from fiction to within sight. I remember it was cool in tech that you could get a flash drive that was big enough to store Wikipedia on it. And now it's with some of these miniature models, you're going to have something 10 times more knowledgeable than that in your pocket that you can access without an internet connection.
Mm-hmm.
That really brings it home in many ways. You're like, holy cow, what used to be the entirety of the internet is now in my pocket.
Yep.
And I don't even need an internet connection to talk to it. That's wild. Even before you get to multimodal video, imagery, all that.
It's like someone who actually knows the whole internet and can respond to you. So it's not even you having to read through billion-page book. It's someone that is almost like an oracle who's I know where that book is and here's the information. The next step is actually understand that information and act on it. Because then suddenly you're hey, I want to know about starting a business, but actually, can you just tell me what I should start a business on? How about you go do it? These are obviously not quite there. We do have a paper we want to talk about, which might be for the next episode, about the fact that we're getting even close to that now. But it is crazy to think the pace. And I think a lot of folk, if you're not in the tech space, you kind of don't see this rapid change.
It's just a chatbot. If you're not in the tech space, you're there's a cool chatbot I can talk to, and you're not, because it hasn't been delivered to all the services you're used to.
And maybe ChatGPT was you had your wow moment, right?
Yeah.
And you've had a year and change to sort of internalize it, but you haven't made the next leap, right? You haven't looked at, what does this mean when it's completely multimodal? What does it mean when it's doing self-play? What does it mean when there are a bunch of agents going behind the scenes and they're all smarter than you? And
I think there's another moment coming where it's going to be building something in front of you, and that breaks people's brain. Because
Isn't
some
that kind
moments
of cloud? Isn't that kind of cloud artifacts, and that's why it took over Twitter?
Yeah, but people don't know that. People don't know that's out there.
Yeah.
So, like in sort of the normal space outside of tech, someone I know, they're a retiree, right? They successfully argued with their HOA using ChatGPT.
Uh-huh.
That was like revolutionary to them, right? Because it could grok what the HOA was saying, it could look at all the laws, and it could come back and say, here's a bulleted. And no matter how persistent the HOA was, it could just generate a response and keep coming back. And they were just copy pasting. This isn't some fancy API access. But that's where they're at. They're thinking about this as like, oh, this is like an intelligent chatbot that can write me emails and it can write me documents. And I think that's the biggest, like the future's here, not evenly distributed moment is we're looking at it going, you're going to get to, and this is another episode, you're going to get to an internet that's entirely personalized. Mm-hmm. Like you're going to get to being able to have this thing make stuff just for you, right? We aren't used to bespoke technology anymore because for the longest time it was you had to make something that could be commonly used by 1 billion people or 100 million people or 1 million people. And now you're getting to this thing can make something that just needs to be used by you and it can ingest content into that. That is a really big mental shift that's hard to grok. Pun intended, grok.
And in an interesting way, people have been like sort of having to warm up to this, right? Like, you know, as you interact with the internet over the years, right, it's become more and more personalized, more and more echo chambery, more and more fragmented, but it's not actually personalized, right? It's like this like least common denominator personalization.
Yes,
how can we put you into one of the 6 buckets that we have? And then rile that bucket up, right, and make them click. And so I think an optimistic view of this AI personalization is that it like is actually giving you what you want as opposed to what you think you want, if that makes sense.
Right.
I was going to say that on the other end of the spectrum, though, that is also worth calling out is people who need to, I think, warm down a little bit, and that they are so trying to like understand this without maybe having all the like technological backing that they're like screaming that like OpenAI is a dead company because we haven't had GPT-5 come out, right? Like the degree at which this is becoming useful is absolutely bonkers, right? Like, you know, this research, like AI has been a thing for like the last like 50 years. Right, these are things and concepts that have just like come online because of certain technological advances, Moore's law, etc. Like again, good podcast episodes. I think some people in the tech space definitely do need to be like, because their expectations of unbelievable exponential scaling weren't met in the last year, they're like, this is dead. Like I'm going back to crypto, right? And I think that's not necessarily the right way to view it. It should be like, hey, we're talking now societal problems. Right, there are very real things, and even talking about the nationalization point, there are probably things like even not being released right now, which are insane. Like we can only like speculate and think about what they're going to be and try and like extrapolate out. But I think people are not making in that like when you talk about like a massive change like this that takes only 10 years, that's insane. You think of like how fast the physical world change, it's so much slower. So to think that the software is going to crazily change and we have this like entirely different paradigm is going to be very disruptive. And I think sometimes the like timescales proposed by a lot of folks are like actively like detrimental to society. Right? If we did have this like super intelligence in like a year, I don't think we're ready for it. I don't think like politicians and like the law is going to keep up with it. I mean, for good reason. It's hard to.
And I think building off your point, there's this assumption that if we waved our wand and let's say GPT-5 is true AGI, it's extreme, it's multimodal, it can do all these things, that suddenly all the applications we're dreaming of will just manifest. Right? We still have to build. We still have to build with the AI otherwise, but you're still going to build services, right? Even in an AGI world, someone still has to figure out what the McDonald's menu looks like. Someone still has to figure out what your personal website looks like. Someone still has to figure out how cars work. You're still going to have to take a long time to take this better tool and actually see it manifest things in the real world. There's this assumption in the AI space that like overnight everything just has an agent and everything's Blade Runner. And you're like, no, that all takes time to build. The holograms take time to build. The personality of the robotaxi takes time to build, right? All of these things take tons of time to build. I think that's a weird thing in the space right now is that people assume just when we get a model of the sufficient level that we're waving a magic wand and it's all there. It's like, no, if you want a tax prep agent, you still got to work with the thing. You still got to tune it to do this. You still got to focus it. You still have to figure out the right interface. That's a whole different episode, but it's not obvious to me that people want to write paragraph-long prompts forever. That seems crazy. And so there's still a lot of unknown unknowns to AI. And the sports centerification of model races on Twitter is crazy, right? It's like LeBron misses a basket and suddenly he's trash, right? Like OpenAI doesn't release a model every other month and suddenly they're dead. And you're like, that's insane.
I mean, I am kind of here for it. It makes like the last 3 months have been super entertaining. Whether that's actually useful or not, like, you know, when we're like building on stuff, like, I don't know. But it is entertaining nonetheless. But anyway, I think we should start wrapping up here. We have plenty of new episodes after this. I think we did a good job covering some of the news from this week. And then we have probably, I didn't count, but maybe like 15 new episode ideas that we will probably expand on. And we didn't even probably cover all of this week's news. So I think that's how much is going on at the moment. So
wild times.
It was wild times. It was great to see both. And we will certainly do another one very soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Just an ask for the people in the comments. Like, give us feedback. Like, we talked about a lot of stuff.
What do you want to hear about?
What do you want to hear?
Do you want more guest appearances from the puppy? That's another question to answer that.
The puppy tag.
Oh, and the prompt is what comes first, GPT-5 or GTA 6? Debate.